All right. Well, thank you everyone for this opportunity to contribute to this conference. This is a great conference. I was there in person, I don't know, it was 3 or 4 years ago. Enjoyed it thoroughly. Wish I could be there again with you today. As my presentation is indicated, I'm going to be talking about this, well, somehow I got the wrong, that's the title I want. Balancing an MRTN approach with environmental outcomes. So, and I'm going to start off by, get this to asking the group here in attendance, whether you're by Zoom or in the room, a question. And I want you to come up with a number and put your number into the chat box or however you're getting feedback. And so this is the question I'm going to ask. If corn grain nitrogen recovery efficiency averages about 40%, and there's been studies done all over the world with different grain crops, and with corn, generally you'll see numbers between 30 and 40%, but we're going to use this word, this average of about 40%. If the average is 40%, what is the efficiency? What is that nitrogen recovery efficiency for the last pound of nitrogen applied to get the economic optimal yield, which is like the MRTN number that might be used, like what Dan was just talking about. So that last pound of nitrogen you put out, what is the recovery efficiency in the grain with that? So if you have a guess on that, I'd love to have you put that in the chat box, and we're going to come back to that here later in the program. So I'm going to start off by I'm borrowing a set of slides from a colleague friend of mine that I went to school with, undergraduate school 35, 40 years ago, Alan Blaylock, who's a senior agronomist with Nutrien. And he had done this recently, and I'm going to run through these and because I want to put some context to what I'm going to be talking about today. And so one of the things that he summarized was the fact that there's tremendous, there's been an uptick in crop prices. We all can see that. This is looking at about the 10-year average, and we can see that those prices are really pretty good over across multiple commodities. If you look at the, I wanted to get this out of my way so it's not blocking my view here. Hold on just a second. If you look at the crop to use ratios, so let's say how much is there kind of in store ready to be sold, you can see that there's ending stocks are really pretty low right now. If you look at the exports, and so we have the green line is over the year what it was last year for corn on the left, and on the right it's the soybean exports. And the dashed black line is the 10-year average. It also shows the 2019-20 year as being kind of below, but then you see how much higher, almost doubling in the exports that we had last year. And I updated Alan's slide to current, so we can see how current exports are trending relative to the average. And you can see soybeans started pretty close to being right on the average, but it's now ticking up, and corn is a little under what it was last year, but it's still very high, much greater than 10-year average. If you look at the structural, where that demand is coming from, it's coming largely from China because of the shift that they're doing in feed rations and building out structures for their hog herd, and so they're not able to produce the grain that they need, and so that export demand is largely coming from China. And then we also have record natural gas prices in Europe that have resulted in plant shutdowns and price increases, and that's relatively recent, and so that also is having an effect. So as you summarize all these little elements that I just provided from Alan's slides, you have strong global demand for commodities. You have China push for higher yields and grain imports. You have energy volatility. You have production curtailments resulting from high energy costs. You have skyrocketing energy costs in Europe. And you have low fertilizer commodity inventories in key global markets. So that's where we're at, and this is the reason why things are just, there's so much uncertainty associated with crop prices and nitrogen and the availability of nitrogen, and therefore there's so much interest in what do we do about nitrogen. For many years we knew it was important, we made decisions, but now it seems like we're heightened. There's a teaching moment relative to nitrogen management and what we should be doing. And the question I would have us launch into this presentation then is, why is it important to improve on what is acceptable for corn nitrogen rate decisions? That decision, as we have focused on in much of the morning, is driven by economics, and even more so now, and the risk associated with those economics. But is that all we should be using? One of the ways I like to think about nitrogen is when I think of the kind of the nitrogen cycle, and there's all these different arrows and boxes and places where nitrogen can go. It's a good structure to think about nitrogen, and the center of this nitrogen cycle, and it's often actually, you know, drawn out this way, is a plant. A plant kind of is an important centerpiece of how we think about nitrogen, what is going to be happening with that nitrogen. But one of the things, because of the chemistry associated with nitrogen, its need, its biological sensitivity to nitrogen, we have all these pathways, and therefore there's a potential loss. And one of the ways I like to think about it is using the barrel that we used in our beginning soils class to talk about Liebig's law of the minimum, and we used those slats to represent different elements that are essential elements. But I like to think of this also barrel, you could directly use this as representing that nitrogen cycle, where the yield, or the yield that you're getting, is an individual slat. The full barrel is the yield potential or optimal yield. You have nitrogen fertilizer coming into that barrel with drops of water, and the more you put in the barrel, more of those slats are kind of exposed, and you get end-loss pathways. So that's what happens is with nitrogen, you kind of expose it to more loss pathways, more vulnerabilities as you get closer to this optimal yield, or economic optimal yield. And that's as Dan just talked about, this quadratic plateau response function. That's as you get up on that quadratic and close to that plateau, you're exposing more of these slats, and so that it gets leakier. We're not as able to keep that nitrogen on the field. So why put a focus on corn nitrogen? Of the 5 leading grain crops, corn accounts for 40% of the global grain production. It contains over 60 million metric tons of nitrogen, which accounts to about 30% of the nitrogen of the 5 leading grain crops. And from global end budgets, corn fertilizer nitrogen use efficiency on average ranges between 30 and 40%. That initial question, I said about 40%. So that's that same number there. So, so with that, we have to then kind of see, and if we look at our great planet and look at the reactive nitrogen, reactive nitrogen is that nitrogen that's not stable. It's the contributions of reactive nitrogen come from industry, and it comes from agriculture. And so the big agricultural regions of the world are the regions that we see reactive nitrogen so significant. So this is a big deal, and it's a big deal from the standpoint of the consumer and governments, and just trying to figure out how we do the best job we can. And in the past, the benefits have been well recognized, and we recognize that when it comes to corn production, we double, if not more, the amount of corn we can take off the field when we add nitrogen fertilizer. But we also have to recognize that with that there are some liabilities. And how do we balance those two? I won't go into this very much because the previous speakers, Dan and Matt, both talked about the quadratic plateau response function, or what we typically see when we add nitrogen and the yield response. You have that optimal yield, black line representing the optimal N rate, and then depending on the price of corn and the cost of the nitrogen, the economic optimal N rate is something typically on the order of 10, 15, maybe 20 pounds on average over a lot of these kind of response for functions, less than the optimal N rate. And as and there's that label for that. But as Fabian shared earlier this morning too, he shared a number of different graphs that look like this. So what we end up having, we have that quadratic plateau, but as we get close to that plateau, the N loss really starts to kick in. So the pink here represents N rates above EONR. Below that, you can see that we're starting to increase, but it almost increases exponentially in terms of N loss, or unaccounted for N at the end of the growing season. So this is the storyline, and so it comes back to my title where we're talking about this maximum return to nitrogen, and how do we balance that? Because this is based on economics, and how do we take into consideration things other than just economics, primarily the environmental costs, the long-term environmental impact? Is there a way of thinking about this differently than the way we've done in the past? Work that we had done working with Fabian and throughout the Midwest area, we took all these different tools that have been developed over time, and we looked at them, and we looked at the MRTN, and we compared them with each other, and we've seen that some of these tools work on average pretty well. And in fact, the MRTN, and this is taking a recommendation with the tool and you subtract off the economic optimal N rate, and you can see MRTN is actually really close to being on average about 0, which is what you want. You want it to be right there at 0. And there's a lot of others though that are really close to 0. But the problem is, on average, isn't very site specific. And so you had a number of sites that were under, you had a number, or tools that under recommended, and you had a number of tools that over recommended. Those sites are right there, are the ones you want. But unfortunately, what you also have is, if we look at it in kind of a distribution to that average, so this is the same as that previous graph at the 0, but it's showing how the about 50 different sites, how they were distributed in terms of the N rate relative to that tool and the EONR. And you can see these box and whiskers, what they do is they just represent a wide range. And the take home of this, and this is our yield goal methods, this is looking at soil test methods here, this is looking at, this is the pre-plant soil nitrate test, this is the sidedress nitrate test, and then there's a few others, including MRTN. And you can see what we want is something that's really close to 0, but we'd love to have it to be where there's not a lot of depth in your boxes. We'd like, and not a lot of tails on those whiskers. We'd like everything to be really close. But again, the nature of nitrogen is it's really tough to get tools they're gonna collapse that down, just because of the uncertainty that exists with nitrogen every year. Is EONR, or is the basis for how we use the MRTN, because again, the MRTN uses an economic optimal N rate to come up with that rate to apply. Is it the right rate for corn nitrogen fertilizer management? Again, the background of that is it's one-dimensional. It's economic only. It ignores other implications, most notably the environmental costs, or the unintended negative side of costs. And frankly, there's a lot of evidence that insurance nitrogen is alive and well under an EONR, or MRTN era. Why? And the reason for that is I think there are conditions with too much rainfall or uneven rainfall are easily recognized by farmers. And so it's that uncertainty by weather that largely drives insurance nitrogen fertilizer additions. So even though we encourage a tool like MRTN, my experience in working with producers and different surveys suggests that they still add. There's still an add-on to that. Maybe with the cost of nitrogen like they are now, maybe not so much, but historically that's been the case. So how do we balance? Well, economics with environment. One approach has been to use these metrics that we call nitrogen use efficiency. What's the efficiency of which we're using that nitrogen? And there's different ways to calculate that, and they have different meanings and in different applications. But this is over the last 3 or 4 decades. This is one way we've done that. The other is to attempts to add environmental outcomes to the message. There's been workshops, conferences, not unlike this one right here, educational programs. One I was involved in was trying to look at how BMPs to recover that nitrogen that was lost and once it got into the water. That was about 15 years ago. There's been suggestions of integrating economic with the environmental so it's basically tying the economic optimal end rate functions with some social costs. I'm not advocating for that. I'm just saying this is the approaches that have been taken. In some areas of the world, they have already gone to government fertilizer allocations or even a use tax with nitrogen fertilizer. And that's been their solution for trying to integrate environmental outcomes. And other places, and there's been some here in the Midwest. I know a few in Iowa, there may be some in Minnesota too, where there's local government cost share and other incentive programs offered to producers that kind of back off, not put as much on as they have. And so that's kind of a watershed level kind of programs that are there. And we're seeing more and more of those type of things. I'm going to suggest something else. I'm going to suggest, let's look at this entirely differently. I'm going to start with this quote from Clayton Christensen, who was a Harvard business professor. Sometimes we have to step back and just say, is there some change that we need to do? And he said, successful people in societies are humble, and this produces high self-esteem. And from such, they have an instinctive attitude to learn from others what to change and even to be corrected. I'm suggesting that maybe we need to be corrected in terms of the way we think about nitrogen. And maybe it's so much more than just an economic production function. We've been doing this with MRTN and other tools that the gold standard is economics. And it's everything we think about is in terms of the economics. And I'm suggesting maybe we need to look at this, step back and look at this differently. So this concept of an incremental nitrogen use efficiency was first introduced by a guy by the name of Akeem Doberman. And it was just kind of a conceptual thing he had in a paper. He basically said as the nitrogen uptake increases, the incremental nitrogen or recovery efficiency is going to decrease. That's just because that barrel, it gets leakier. And so you're actually decreasing that recovery efficiency. And in this little figure that he had in that paper, you can see how that's going down. Well, we did that same thing. Some colleagues that I've worked with over the years, and we said we can take kind of a set value of how much nitrogen is in the grain, and we can take that quadratic plateau function and we can actually do some calculus with it and come up with some what we call the incremental nitrogen use efficiency as you increase the nitrogen rate. And so that's what we've done, and it's some analysis we've done over a bunch of different sites here in the Midwest. And the reason why, again, the reason why this is going down, the incremental nitrogen efficiency, is because there's more opportunities for loss in that, again, that visual of the barrel here. So back to this question I asked earlier, if corn grain nitrogen recovery efficiency averages 40%, what is the efficiency for the last pound of nitrogen applied to get to the economic optimal yield? Where you can think about that last pound of your MRTN recommendation, if it was 142, as Dan was saying, what was the recovery efficiency of going between 141 and 142? And this analysis, this kind of surprised me. So this is taking each one of these lines represents a different quadratic plateau response function. And it's looking at that incremental nitrogen use efficiency as you increase in N rate. So where these lines end would represent the economic optimal N rate for that site. So this one is about 40 kilograms, which is about just under 40 pounds per acre. And then you get out here, you can see that economic optimal N rate is much higher for these. The point is that they all ended at the same spot. Now this is for $4 corn, 40-cent nitrogen, this analysis. And but it ends at 6.4%. If you increase the cost of nitrogen and keep the price of corn the same, it goes up a little bit, but it's still less than 10%. The average incremental NUE for that first pound is about 80%. So you're getting 80% of that first pound that you put out on the field, you get that back in the grain. But you can see how these slide down, and the point is grain nitrogen recovery efficiency for those last pounds of nitrogen put on the field are extremely low, less than 10%, probably closer to 5, 6, 7%. And we did this with a number of different response functions. So then we took these same and we said, well, what if we were to forego some profit and back off? Say we were going to fertilize with MRTN, but not apply, 20, 30 pounds. How much profit is really lost? And this really is just a different way of looking at what Dan was just talking about from the standpoint of how much yield loss is there. And it's not a lot if you go less. With minor sub EONR fertilization, so there's profit loss is minimal, yet it eliminates those low incremental nitrogen use efficiencies, those that are down below 10, below 15%. You've taken them off the board. And when you do that, over all of these, over 200 sites that we were looking at, this is what you get. So the average nitrogen use efficiency over all of them, if you were fertilizing at EONR, is right around 40. This shows it just a little bit above 40%. But you really get an uptick fairly quickly. And I apologize, this is in dollars per hectare, but because I have this version of this in a dollars per acre, and for some reason I didn't grab the right one here. But you get a tremendous uptick in the average nitrogen use efficiency by getting rid of those low incremental ones. So as I thought about this, and I thought, maybe the way we're really going to kind of work this balance between economics and the environment is we just have to recognize that there has to be an approach that allows us to back off. But since there's a public benefit, there's public value, maybe the public then helps to compensate for that loss that is going to come when the producer is at sub EONR. This is a great conclusion slide that it's not my statement, it's from some folks there at Indiana, at Purdue, and a recent little publication they put out. Remember that nitrogen use in corn is part of a complex biological system that interacts with everything under the sun and it's difficult to model with computer programs. We cannot accurately predict the weather. We cannot accurately predict soil and supply or availability throughout the year. Yet we cannot afford financially or environmentally to simply apply more than enough nitrogen. Concluding thoughts. We shouldn't be satisfied with where we're at for managing nitrogen fertilizer. If we can, my thinking here is if we continue to just use an economic production function, it's only a matter of time before governments are going to come in and they're going to take control. And we've been hearing this message over and over again. I know there in Minnesota, there's a lot of people that would like to do that now. There's other places that have suggested that should happen here in the Midwest. We do need better tools to integrate site-specific conditions of soil and weather in order to get at how much N to apply for this year. And in some cases that, in my opinion, is deserving of an adaptive approach, which would be more in-season applications of nitrogen. Examining this principle or this concept of incremental NUE helps expose the need for exploring more sustainable N fertilizer practices. I'm interested in knowing from Tim, or and in terms of what everyone thought there, in terms of what that was the efficiency of that last pound that was applied. So I'm going to have to, when I get to the questions, maybe he can help summarize that for us. But most people, when I have talked to them, they thought, oh, maybe 20%, maybe 25%. That means only 25% was getting in the grain, but it's actually much lower than that. And I think this analysis helps us to realize how bad it really is when you're at EONR, economic optimal N rate. Since all society would be beneficiaries of improved crop nitrogen use efficiency by mitigating against low incremental NUE, I am suggesting that programs that provide incentive payments to producers seem appropriate when their proven practices are used that improve overall NUE through 4R stewardship, to match anticipated foregone profit from sub-EONR applications. And I thought I had a third point, but I guess I don't. So that's my message, is that we can't ignore the environmental issues associated with nitrogen fertilizer management. And if we can quantify the economic benefits, then that same quadratic plateau function helps us to also quantify an environmental aspect of this, that low incremental nitrogen use efficiency. And maybe we can turn around and use that for our benefit in terms of developing programs to actually compensate farmers for being at sub-EONR. Thank you for your attention. I hope you've been giving me your attention. I don't know if I'm going to stop share here now, and so I can see. I don't have a multiple screen here, so I don't know. Tim, if you were you able to catch any summary over what others said on that question?
There, try it again. I had you on.
That was a wise move.
Yeah.
Do we have any questions for Newell in the audience here? Newell, can you see that on the screen?
Great food for thought.
Yep.
Am I supposed to see a question in that?
Yeah. Okay, let's give him a hand.
All right, thanks.
Thank you, Newell.